So, I was asked to talk about transdisciplinary research cultures by Inger, and I thought, okay, nice challenge. I hope you won't all fall asleep. So, I want to start with maybe a few words about how I came to be interested in transdisciplinarity and to a certain research culture within transdisciplinarity in very shortly. Actually, for me, the entry into transdisciplinarity came through the work on complexity that has been done by Edgar Morin, a French colleague, in the 1970s and early 1980s in a series of books that he called La Méthode in the first and second volume. That came, but actually the story is a bit longer, of course, and goes a bit more back. That came through a kind of an interest I had for quite a while in the relationship between sustainability or unsustainable development, and its relationships to culture, and especially its relationships to the arts, how the arts have to do with this whole questions, and more generally how creative practices in society have something to do with unsustainable development or sustainable development processes. That's something that started for me quite a while ago as a student. 2001, I was studying in Rotterdam, and there was this guy, Hans Dilleman, who was teaching there at the Erasmus Universiteit Rotterdam about art and sustainability. And I was like, whoa. Since then, it never left me in a way. So through Dilleman and through this kind of through leaving the kind of multidisciplinary environment that I was in France, which was Sciences Po, where you do all those disciplines neatly next to each other, and they don't really relate at all. So that's multidisciplinary. That's what I was used to for a while. When I came to Holland and studied in Rotterdam, there was that guy, Hans Dilleman, and then he made me. I was part of some kind of some workshops that were organized by Dennis Meadows. You probably know Dennis Meadows from the Club of Rome report, long while ago, 70s. So systems thinking, and the way Meadows was organizing systems thinking games. Could also have organized sessions of systems thinking games, but that would be another way to, in a more embodied way, to have this discussion. But that's not what I will do today. I'm sorry. You will have to stay seated in those terrible chairs. So, yeah, systems thinking. Dennis Meadows. Then I got interested in system theories. There's all sorts of different theories of systems. Niklas Luhmann, Jacques Ellul, Howard Becker, Gregory Bateson. I mean, there's a whole world in there, which is quite interesting. And from there, I came eventually to the complexity approach of Morin. And from there, I discovered Bazaram Nicolescu, whom I will discuss a bit more today. So that was my entry into transdisciplinarity through the Nicolescu school, so to say. And my interest was then to look into how this kind of transdisciplinary way of working could be interesting to look into the notion of cultures of unsustainability or cultures of sustainability, and also related to something I will mention later on during the talk, which is aesthetics of complexity, which is what I've been working on in the past few years. But while I was doing that, I realized that there were other people who were also talking about transdisciplinarity, but they were using totally different approaches, or at least it looked like it. It also looked like we didn't have so much in common. So I realized there were several research cultures of transdisciplinarity, and that's why I can try to answer to the challenge that Inger gave me to try to talk about research cultures of transdisciplinarity. So that's what I will start and try doing here, giving some overview of some of the main traditions that have developed over the past couple of decades in terms of transdisciplinarity. Of course, I'm sure you know of other trends and streams, and those that I will describe might seem to you very provincial from your perspective, but that's unavoidable. So, transdisciplinary research cultures. So in the early 1970s, this word transdisciplinarity appears in France at some conference where you have Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, and Erich Jansch, the physicists discussing, and then you have some kind of notion appearing about recovering a kind of unity of knowledge, a kind of recovery from the curse of a fragmentation of disciplinarity. But back then it seems that there was not so much use of the term for a while until it re-emerged in the second half of the 1980s. And then it re-emerged with two parallel streams, which is quite interesting. And that's what I will discuss now. These two parallel streams, on the one hand, was happening more or less, let's say, in the French-speaking world and Latin languages-speaking world. So we include Spain and South America, Latin America, I mean also Mexico, so also Central, or North America, sorry, next Mexico is North America. On the other hand, another stream in German-speaking countries that also then expanded or was related also to the English, German and English-speaking countries. But that was later. But still in the late, in the late 70s and early 80s, it's not so fair to say that nothing happened, because actually that's the time when Edgar Morin was publishing his books on La Méthode and all these notions about complexity, which have had a big influence, at least on the French stream of transdisciplinarity. So, or French, Spanish, Mexican, etc. So there were things happening in the 80s, but it's only from the mid-80s onwards that it starts really being visible again. Also, you have to keep in mind that, of course, in the late 80s and early 90s, you have all those growing calls for science-society partnerships. It's very clear in the Agenda 21 from the Rio conference, so 1992. There you have those clear calls which are echoing or reinforcing the work of people who are starting those kind of transdisciplinary research. So then we have this kind of paradoxical situation that's becoming clear, at least to a number of people in the 90s. We have a technological development, among other things, that brings contemporary challenges to a search for sustainable development. It involves a great complexity, and then when society starts asking science, you have to resolve, or you have to contribute to resolving all those problems. But at the same time, of course, one is aware, at least some people are aware, that those technological developments are to some part the result of this very strong specialization, this very strong fragmentation of the sciences. So that one could discuss more details, much longer about this paradox, or this apparent paradox, and have a whole discussion about the technological system. I could talk about Jacques Ellul, etc., but I won't do that here because I want to focus more on the transdisciplinary research cultures themselves. So next to that, of course, there's fragmentation, one issue that people were getting aware of very much. Another one is simplification, the problem of simplification people became aware of. Now, I will quote my colleague Volker Kirchberg from Leuphana, opening quote, "Disciplinary processes emphasize the simplification of a research object, that is, the perspective on this object. The problem is that complex reality resists simplification." And then he writes later on in the same text, "In multidisciplinary objects are still analyzed individually or neatly separated, and then in a number of disciplines. So the result is that the scientific treatment and the logic of the object is without contradictions." That's a big problem, the lack of contradictions within the disciplines. So end of quote. So actually all or nearly all of the approaches that call themselves transdisciplinarity are rooted in a realization, in the thought that disciplinary and to some extent even interdisciplinary science cannot meet those challenges of unsustainable development. So transdisciplinarity is an approach to research that's clearly oriented, on the one hand, towards society and concrete issues, problems, and on the other hand, towards the Lebenswelt, as the Germans say, I don't know in English, life world or something. So first I want to mention some common elements that are shared by those different transdisciplinary approaches, those different research cultures I want to discuss. So generally, transdisciplinarity recognizes uncertainty and incompleteness as an unavoidable condition that research is facing. So it opens itself to perspectives, to insights that come from outside the boundaries of science, and to collaborations with actors who are also outside the disciplinary borders of science. So in this way, transdisciplinarity is always involving a constant learning process that mutually affects all actors. However, how far that learning process is reaching is different depending on which transdisciplinary research culture we are talking about, which will become clearer in the next minutes. So the goal of transdisciplinarity is not merely to explain reality or to understand the world, which of course it does, it tries to understand the world, but it's also to change the world, to transform it. Very much in this nice table from yesterday, the last column, transform. It's, you can put the transdisciplinarity in it somehow. So transdisciplinarity is not an approach or a set of approaches that claims the so-called value neutrality. Transdisciplinarity assumes its normativity. It doesn't really have a problem with that, unlike many colleagues in the interdisciplinary realm. Transdisciplinarity recognizes the insights from a whole number of things that happened in academic discussions over the past decades, especially the sociology of science, Bruno Latour and co., showing how science is context-dependent, how science is influenced by cultural, political, economic contexts, etc. Most transdisciplinary researchers have abandoned the traditional belief in a kind of objective science that would be cleansed from subjectivity and cleansed from interests. So, as I said, Latour, but also Edouard Said and others, I'm not going to make a whole discussion on that now, but a whole number of people in the social and cultural sciences have had an influence on those developments. On the other hand, there's also an influence from science, from hard science, from physics, and especially from the so-called Copenhagen circle of quantum physicists. Yes. Yeah, so quantum physicists, which have to do with this relationship between observation and the actualization of reality, how there's a relationship between the way you observe and the actualization of physical reality. So all of that have...
What is it?
I have no clue. I will just go on talking. Huh? Yeah. So all of that, all of these things have played a role in bringing across these realizations of contextualization of science. Okay. Yeah, can you just... Yeah, that would be great for now. And then we can start it again for video. Yeah. So, where was I? Yeah. So, I will just talk from behind him. Thanks a lot. So, transdisciplinarity is therefore, across its different streams and traditions that I will try to shortly discuss today, a case of what Gibbons in the 90s called Mode 2 research. Maybe, I guess, many of you must have heard about it, Mode 1 research and Mode 2 research. The idea is, Mode 1 research would be something like most disciplinary research, and it's something looking for universal principles to explain phenomena. And then Mode 2 research abandons that claim, universal principles to explain phenomena, and instead recognizes that context dependency of science. So it does not try to reach some absolute knowledge anymore. And then you also have other authors in the whole area of futures studies, like you have this whole journal, Futures. But I won't discuss them today in detail. That's not a stream I will discuss very much. But they also then talk about post-normal science that also appears in the 1990s, this notion of post-normal science. Another important difference between Mode 1 and Mode 2 research is that Mode 1 research is very happy with language. I mean, it relates to what you said yesterday about language in the white paper. Mode 1 science is very happy with, or very satisfied, let's say, with using a language that is meant to be understood by disciplinary peers. And actually, the most far away, the most you extirpate yourself from this kind of polysemic dirt of everyday language, the better it is, the more scientific you are. So you shouldn't belong to the Lebenswelt in that case. You really should belong to your disciplinary language. And if other people don't understand you, what does it matter? Actually, it's a good sign. However, in Mode 2 research language is not intending so much to further contribute to this kind of atomized or atomization of a consensual knowledge within the circle of peers. Mode 2 research tries to deal differently with language and has those challenges that, in a way, Jos was mentioning yesterday in a concrete, practical way. These are challenges of transdisciplinarity. Transdisciplinarity implies transgressing disciplinary norms to create new knowledge, and it requires relinquishing sovereignty by individual disciplines. It doesn't allow all those imperialisms that one sees always from each other's disciplines. It implies also behaving more like poachers than like licensed hunters. You don't have a license to be transdisciplinary. So some researchers describe this difference between interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity with a kind of image of a mosaic. And then you would have those interdisciplinary researchers, and they have a little piece of mosaic, and they try to put them together, and then they try to find relationships between the little pieces of a mosaic. And then transdisciplinarity would be something where you manage to have kind of broader view, and then you can try to start interpreting motives of the entire mosaic and not just relationship between little pieces of a mosaic. However, I don't find that image great, to be honest. It's not very adequate, this mosaic image. And here, I will quote Kirchberg again, my close colleague. So opening quote, interdisciplinarity is built on overlapping understanding and consensus. And it searches for coherent and compatible knowledge. So you still have that in the interdisciplinary process. It is possible to create a synthesis of these findings. Transdisciplinarity, on the other hand, is built on the confrontation of different, even contradictory findings. And this confrontation will not necessarily result in consensus. That's really a big difference. So it's not really a mosaic in a way, if you don't know so much of a consensus. So the mosaic image, I'm not sure. But again, there's a number of from to dichotomies that my colleague Kirchberg also made, I think after Gibbons and Klein and some others who talk about transdisciplinarity, from this kind of path from disciplinary to transdisciplinary science, a kind of change of knowledge. So he's talking of going from simplicity to complexity, from unambiguousness to hybridity, from linearity to non-linearity, from universality of what has been unified to integration of what is different, from fragmentation to cooperation, from stabilizing boundaries to creating more permeable membranes, or Niculescu even talks about things that are, there's not need borders anymore, it's not a continuous territory, that's even something else. And then, Kirchberg also talks about the individual, going from the individual knowledge of a few, the peers, to a dialogue about knowledge with the many who are networked. So now we'll come to differentiating more of those different approaches to, at least two different approaches to transdisciplinarity, which I will label as the ETH, research culture, I will come to that in a second, versus the CIRE, research culture. These are two research institutes that I will discuss shortly. The ETH is the Swiss Federal Institute for Technology in Zurich, and the CIRE is a research center in Paris that's led by Basarab Niculescu, a Romanian quantum physicist. But before I come to those two, there's a third one, which is represented by a German guy. So I just put his name because I don't think it's a very followed approach as much as the other ones. So it's like a kind of exception, and I won't discuss him very much, but still I want to mention it. There's also someone called Jürgen Mittelstraß, who since 1987 also used the term of transdisciplinarity, but in my view it's a very conservative way of seeing interdisciplinarity. It's interdisciplinarity as real transdisciplinarity as real interdisciplinarity. So he refuses theorizing on the meta level. He refuses any standards any changes in the standards of rationality of science. He refuses transgressing disciplinary norms. So for him, transdisciplinarity is a kind of affirmation of scientific rationality and a unification of scientific rationality for it to better address real social problems. So it's a kind of science imperialist transdisciplinarity, and that's very different from the others. So I'm not going to discuss that very much. To me, this is not transdisciplinarity at all, but anyway, the term is also used for a long while in this approach. So now we'll come more closely and more details to the other approaches I find more interesting. So first, the ETH approach. So that's an approach that's, of course, very strong in Switzerland, where it started, Zurich. It's also very strong in Germany. It's also quite strong in the US, especially in the whole realm you might be aware of, which is called sustainability science. So the initial node was at ETH, so in Zurich, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, from the early 1990s onwards. Then they had a big Keystone conference in 2000, where they all met together and they defined transdisciplinarity, and then everybody who was not at that conference is not doing transdisciplinarity. And then there were further nodes that were created, one of them, so some of them are seeing themselves as the carriers of the flag of the real transdisciplinarity, one of them being my university, Leuphana, which has people who have been trained at the ETH, who are now in Leuphana. Another one is ASU, Arizona State University in Phoenix, and the people are also coming from the ETH. So that's the ETH armada. So there's a very strong focus on in this approach, one strong focus on joint problem solving. So joint problem solving regarding problems which are at a triad, the triad of science, society, and technology. So that's their main point of interest. The problems that they are trying to look into are, they have to be societally relevant. And the knowledge which is generated has to be, and I'm quoting Daniel Lang, the Dean of our Faculty of Sustainability in Lüneburg, who is from ETH. Sorry, where's my quote? Yeah, the knowledge generated has to be solution-oriented and transferable to societal practice, end of quote. So the kinds of problems that interest this tradition of transdisciplinarity are so-called wicked problems. Ill-defined problems, problems that involve much uncertainty and complexity, also in the different ways they are perceived from different perspectives, so that disciplinary or even interdisciplinary research cannot address them adequately, and then something else is needed, transdisciplinary research. This ETH approach tries to aim at generating three kinds of knowledge: systemic knowledge, goal-oriented knowledge, and transformation knowledge. So systemic knowledge is knowledge about the origins and the developments of societal problems, as well as the interpretations of those problems. So that's systemic knowledge. Goal-oriented knowledge is a normative knowledge that is about the desirable sustainability transformations and exploring that and trying to understand all the different approaches to the desirable sustainability transformations. And third, transformation knowledge is knowledge that deals with the possibilities, that deals with processes of change, that deals with tactics and with strategies. So in a way, it's a strategic knowledge, one could say also. So in this in this approach to transdisciplinarity, the learning process involves, and here I'm quoting Hirsch Hadorn, another German-speaking author, but that's I'm talking English, so usually it's an English quote. Reflections, transformations of attitudes, the development of personal competence and ownership, along with capacity building, institutional transformation, and policy development. So these are the kind of learning processes which are being developed. These learning processes involve some element of learning for the scientist, learning from practitioners, learning from other scientists. But as the quote shows, if you pay attention to it, it's mainly about the learning for the so-called societal stakeholders. So there's mutual learning, but the learning of the societal stakeholders is somehow implicitly more stressed. And actually, I would say, and I'm sure the ETH colleagues would not agree, but I would say that not so much attention is given to a potentially epistemic, transformative learning on the side of the scientists. So in my opinion, the ETH approach is more than its interdisciplinarity, but not so much more. At least it doesn't go very, very far. And well, I will bring some more criticism a bit later. So it's about collaborative research, between academics and scientists, with experts from governmental administrations, with private sector, with NGOs, also with just people who live in a certain area. And of course, this goes beyond an interdisciplinary collaboration, which is limited to academic disciplines. It creates then a kind of complexity that affects the different phases of a research process, the roles taken by academic institutions, the dissemination, the implementation of results, and also the links to education. So there's a whole number of things that are affected by that. So that's in short about the first approach. The second approach, which is the CIRE approach, CIRE stands, I think, for International Center for International Research Center on Transdisciplinarity, or something like that in French. So that was started in Romania, in France and in Romania pretty much at the same time, around the person mainly of Basarab Nicolescu, this quantum physicist. And then it's been also quite influential in places like Mexico and South America also. It started also around the late 80s. The CIRE was created in 1987. And then their Keystone Conference, the big one where many of them gathered together, was in Portugal in Arabida in 1994. This approach considers that, and now I'm quoting Nicolescu, transdisciplinarity concerns that which is at once between the disciplines, across the different disciplines, and beyond all disciplines. Its goal is the understanding of a present world, end of quote. So that's Nicolescu approach. So this is about an effort to find back a unity of knowledge. So back to the discussion of Jansch and Piaget 70s. Finding back a unity of knowledge, but this is then about a complex unity of knowledge. It's not about this kind of trap of a kind of simplifying, reductive unity. It's not about a theory, one theory of everything, not really. So it's not a kind of holistic way of thinking, as many people tend to believe when they see a bit systems thinking, and they say, oh, it's holistic. No, it's not holistic. It's not, also people in the ETH approach, when they look at the Nicolescu approach, they say, oh, this is about being against thinking in terms of contradictions. But no, it's not about against thinking in terms of contradictions. So that's a kind of misrepresentation. I hope I will be able to describe a bit better what the CIRE approach is. So the CIRE approach is actually proposing a set of indeed transversal principles that can found a shared methodology while being open to a diversity of methods. And this shared methodology has three axioms that Nicolescu clarified. The first one is an ontological axiom, which is about having different levels of reality and different levels of perception. Or in the later work of Nicolescu, different levels of reality of the object and different levels of reality of the subject. I will come back to that in a second, the three axioms. The second axiom is the logical axiom. The logical axiom says that the passage from one level of reality to another level is ensured by something called the included middle. I will also explain that in a second, the included versus the excluded middle. And the third axiom is the epistemological axiom, and it says that the structure of the totality of the levels of reality is a complex structure. Every level is what it is because all the other levels exist at the same time. And it's also an open structure, as comes when you really start putting the three axioms together. There's always more levels of reality that can open up. So just to explain it a bit better, you have this notion that that's the logic of non-contradiction, that you cannot have something that's both A and non-A. I mean, A cannot be non-A. Okay? And then you have a notion that if you have something that's P, that's A, then it cannot be non-A, because it's A and it's not non-A. Okay, and pretty simple. That's the logic of non-contradiction. Then you have a logic of contradiction from Stéphane Lupasco, which says No, actually A, I mean P, I mean the third state can also be the included, not excluded middle, but included middle can be both A and non-A at the same time. And then Nicolescu comes, I'm really going fast, I'm summarizing, and says, no, or yes and no. You have the logic of non-contradiction at one level of reality, so A is not non-A. But then if you go to another level of reality, P can be looking across the levels of reality, both A and non-A. It's because you have a reality which is structured in several levels. And you cannot understand reality with one set of theories. You have set of theories for each different level. And then you have something like transversal or trans theories or transdisciplinarity that goes across those levels. And that unites them in a complex way and a way that includes contradictions, not that eliminates them. So in a way, it's not a dualist way of thinking. It's not a monist way of thinking. I don't know how else to call it than a complex way of thinking. There is a quote I have there in my book from a few years ago from Nicolescu also, which I want to read because I think it's quite a helpful quote, which is from the Manifesto of Transdisciplinarity, I think, from Nicolescu. Or is it from another book of his? I think it's from the Manifesto. Anyway, here's the quote. The discontinuous structure of the levels of reality determines the discontinuous structure of transdisciplinary space, which in turn explains why transdisciplinary research is radically distinct from disciplinary research, even while being entirely complementary. Disciplinary research concerns at most one and the same level of reality. Moreover, in most cases, it only concerns fragments of one level of reality. In contrast, transdisciplinarity concerns the dynamics engendered by the action of several levels of reality at once. So, end of quote. So, what also one needs to keep in mind there is that there are levels of reality and there are those levels of either levels of perception in the early versions of the text, of the transdisciplinary, of that research approach, or levels of reality of a subject. But anyway, you have both. That means that if you take the case of research in physics that Nicolescu actually comes from, you only have, so to say, a certain kind of macro-physical level of reality when you can perceive it. But when you develop the tools, the specific microscopes and other tools that allow you to then perceive reality at another level and eventually to perceive it with proper tools of perception or of reality of the subject, as they say, to perceive something else. Then you see there's another level of reality, which is the quantum reality, and where the logic is different. It's not the same logic, it's a different level of reality. And therefore something that where you have a certain contradictions at the macrophysical level, it's quite different. The contradictions are different at the microphysical level. What it also means is that each time you reach a new level of reality, you will also find there a certain logic and certain contradictions. So there will always be some other level of reality from which you can then perceive those contradictions as non-contradictory. So it's an open reality. It's not one that's close to a certain level, a certain number of levels of reality which can be predefined. So, the main consequence of this approach is then that we need to cultivate our knowledge of different levels of reality by resorting to a diversity of ways of knowing, of types of intelligence, and we need all of them. We need analytical intelligence, we need emotional intelligence, we also need sensory intelligence or embodied intelligence, which is not the same as emotional exactly. We need intuitions, resort to intuitive knowing and intuitive learning. We also need the symbolic, we need the narrative, the symbolic and narrative. We also need, or we also can learn from meditative or meditation processes, etc., etc. So all of these are different types of knowledge that can help us to access different levels of reality. A further consequence then is also that the researcher herself or himself forms a constitutive part of the research field. So the traditional subject-object separation then is something that at least has to be discussed or that probably needs to be overcome. So now that you have a view of these two research cultures, and I'm really at all not going fast enough to tell you everything, but anyway, Yeah, you will just get the first part of my talk today. So anyway, I want to discuss some notable differences between the two research cultures, so the ETH approach and the CIRE. So you have to know, I mean, I'm part of my research object, I'm also in there. I'm closer myself to the CIRE approach, the Niculescu one. So in that way, I have a kind of bias. I tend to share more of a kind of CIRE interpretation on the difference between the two approaches. So this is of course a bias, and you can make what you want out of it. And my ETH colleagues who work in Lüneburg would probably see that a bit differently. But anyway, from my perspective, the ETH approach is bless you. The ETH approach is interested in the knowledge residing outside scientific disciplines in terms of professional knowledge. Knowledge which is acquired also from everyday experience in a specific locality. So they are interested in that non-scientific knowledge. However, unlike the CIRE approach, the Niculescu one if you want, it is not interested so much in different ways of knowing. So it involves an epistemic opening, but it's a more limited epistemic opening. Even though it doesn't reject that opening altogether in the way Jürgen Mittelstraß, you always need the evil figures, that's the evil figure, I'm joking. So in the way Mittelstraß would reject that epistemic opening. So this is quite clear in the Zurich definition. You know, I told you the big conference in 2000, the Zurich definition. So the 2000 Congress, there was in a book by Klein and some others this definition of transdisciplinarity, which says the science system is the primary knowledge system in society. Transdisciplinarity is a way of increasing its unrealized intellectual potential and ultimately its effectiveness. So to increase the effectiveness of the science system as the primary knowledge system of society. So that's quite clear. Then there's also Niculescu's writing. He's been writing about the difference between the two, and Niculescu says that he argues that there's a principially different ontological understanding of reality between the two approaches. So the ETH approach, Niculescu labels, I'm not sure it's the best label, but he labels it as a phenomenological transdisciplinarity, which is resulting merely in a horizontal complexity at one level of reality, which is, in a way, the level of analytical knowledge, the level of analytic thinking and knowing. Then the CIRE approach tries to develop more theoretical transdisciplinarity, as Niculescu calls it, and this theoretical transdisciplinarity aims to result in a vertical complexity, which is aiming to link various levels of reality and various types of knowing and various levels of perception. But that also, it doesn't mean that it doesn't want to deal with horizontal complexity. It also has to deal with horizontal complexity. It also involves, when you are in practice, it involves collaborations with artists, collaborations with indigenous peoples, collaborations with practitioners, etc., etc. It's not like rejecting the horizontal complexity. It just wants to have that and the vertical one too. So then one can, on the one hand, see a transdisciplinarity that focuses on the object of research alone, and that in a way leaves intact, mostly intact, the mainstream assumption of a kind of dualism of object and subject. And I'm not fair to the ETH, I would say the ETH is still going a bit in that direction. And then you have a transdisciplinarity that questions the subject-object dualism and that reflexively considers the subject-object interactions. That would be more of a CIRE approach. However, and that's something that a colleague from South Africa, John van Breda, warns against his colleagues at the CIRE side, which is that the focus on real-world problems that the ETH puts at the center is something that should not be abandoned. It should not be something that should be left to the ETH researchers. It's something that where actually the theoretical transdisciplinarity should inform and nourish, and actually does inform and nourish, the phenomenological transdisciplinarity, so that it can bring about some more radical systemic change. So it's not just like, a split between the two. There are also exchanges and information. And someone like John van Breda is very much in between the two. Then I want to talk about some challenges and pitfalls and misadventures of transdisciplinary research cultures. So first I want to mention some challenges. Looking more closely at the ETH approach for a minute or two, or just 1 minute, if we regard the 3 types of knowledge that are sought after by the ETH approach, there are very specific challenges there. First, with systemic knowledge. Systemic knowledge deals with lots of uncertainties. So there's really the challenge of all the uncertainties. Second one, the goal-oriented, the normative knowledge. Well, that one has to deal with conflicting values, with conflicting views of what constitutes the common good. And then if you look at the transformative knowledge, of course the transformative knowledge has to put its hands in policies and politics and has to deal with those challenges. So, more generally, all research cultures of transdisciplinarity are, you see the minute is over already, most research cultures are confronted with one question, and that question is how to best interrelate, combine and integrate the scientific and the non-scientific knowing, but without reductionism. That's a big problem. Without reductionism, in both in the production phase and the dissemination phase of research processes. So how to work with various and sometimes conflicting worldviews and paradigms. Then the split between the ETH and the CIRE I mentioned earlier expresses a kind of tension also between an urge, the urge to solve real world problems. You know, the world is going down. So this kind of urgency of problems of unsustainable development, climate change, biodiversity loss, bee colony collapse, etc., etc., etc. So there's this urgency. And then there's an urgency to find solutions. So that's very, very strong. But on the other hand, there's the idea of the kind of need to fundamentally question, to fundamentally challenge deeply ingrained worldviews. And that's the kind of other driving force, more in the CIRE approach. So that's, in a way, it shows that tension between those two needs, the need of the urgency of the problems and the need of challenging worldviews. So, I mean, my take on it would be that to overcome that split, we have to start looking into more open, more challenging ways to look about solutions. Because one of the problems I have with the ETH, and I will mention it in a second, is the way they look at solutions. And mostly something called problem-based learning. I won't go into details about problem-based learning, but I have problems with problem-based learning. Related to this previous challenge, so, the search process of sustainability requires that we work on all levels of reality. We cannot conveniently leave out some of the ones we are less comfortable with. However, what happens is that this kind of PBL research, I mean problem-based learning, can, at least maybe not always, but often can easily ignore, especially the more than rational levels or the other than rational levels, or let's say not linearly logico-deductive levels, let's say, of intelligence. On the other hand, the CIRE approach, the Nicolescu-inspired approach, can sometimes overemphasize certain other levels of reality, certain other levels of perception. And sometimes it goes very much into a spiritual kind of level, which is, yeah. So even though when you look at Nicolescu himself really tries to warn against that risk, also on the CIRE side. So there's really a need to find a difficult dynamic balance, something that Morin called a unitas multiplex, multiple unity, which is always a difficult challenge. So then I want to discuss some paths to meet those challenges. And that was supposed to be only the middle of my talk, but it probably will be the end, close to the end of it, even so, we'll see. So I think I have like, if you counted, I was having 4 challenges more or less, and I have 8 paths for the 4 challenges, even though they don't really fit nicely in the table like yesterday. So one of the paths is the idea to keep a self-critical, a self-reflexive alertness regarding the different narratives, the different discourses that are being developed by other researchers out there, and what narratives do they have, but also narratives that I develop. What kind of narrative, what kind of discourse am I developing? So there's people who are doing that a lot. For example, in Germany, there's a center which is called the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, and they are doing that kind of thing. What they are doing, for example, another quote from Robert Emmett from that center, it's to provide a critical framework for questioning narratives of global environmental change, including what Emmett calls the crypto-normative discourse that has developed around the Anthropocene, for example. So that's one example of that. Another way to meet, or another element, let's say, of meeting the challenges is about having a very deeply iterative process. So it's about a spiral movement of combined action and reflection. So not just sequentially, as is already advocated by some of my colleagues, especially in the ETH approach, but also simultaneously, a kind of simultaneous iterative process, where, in a way, theory becomes action theory. I mean, action theory is an expression from Oleg Kufud in Copenhagen. Action becomes reflexive action. Problem solving is no longer just problem solving, but it's also questioning. It's also imagining. It's not just implementing. So there's a kind of integrated and simultaneous iterative engagement where things are becoming more messy rather than clearer. Yeah, so the PBL approach and the problem-based learning approach already developed some ways of working in an iterative way, but it's still very sequential, so I still have some problems with it. Someone who has been actually more proposing the more simultaneous iterative approach is Hans Dieleman, who's now working in Mexico. So another element is the way we organize dialogues of knowing. Dialogues of knowing is also an expression coming from Mexico. So Dieleman and his other colleagues, for example, at the University of Veracruz and in Mexico City also. So the point is not to discuss and argue until you arrive at a certain consensus. So remember what I said about that there shouldn't be necessarily a consensus. So this also abandons this kind of idea of common reason, communicative action, Habermas, all of that. It's not really working at all. Instead, the point is to enter a conversation in which you become mutually open to the other beyond the point of being able to fully understand the other in a purely rational or analytical way. Instead, you aim to reach out to the other at multiple levels. So once again, the multiple levels. Intellectually, of course, but also emotionally, but also intuitively and also physically. The outcome does not have to be consensus, once again, because actually the contradictions and the ambivalences are an important part of a complex living world, of this kind of different levels of reality. And collaboration is possible also without consensus or reductionism. And actually, if you get into too much consensus, you should start getting worried about it. Something is wrong. So contradictions are accepted, they are worked with, and they are not ignored, they are also not eliminated, they are also not always solved. In a way, that's another line of discourse, but one could link it to the whole discussion of Laclau and Mouffe on this kind of antagonistic need in society for a democratic society and for multiple claims to hegemony. But that's a whole post-Marxist discourse I will leave on the side. But I think there's a link there. Then, next to that, there's something that my colleagues Uli Wilsmeyer and Daniel Lang, also from Leuphana, who, when they work together, are interesting because Daniel is more ETH and Uli is more open to everything. So I hope she won't dislike it if she sees the video. But anyway, so they wrote some article together which is very, very nice about transdisciplinarity, which actually inspired a lot what I'm saying today, at least for some parts of it. But anyway, so Wilsmeyer and Lang are arguing that the goal of transdisciplinarity should not be to mix the different sorts of knowledge. So, not the nice, melting pot or milkshake. So it's not to mix the different forms of knowledge. It's rather to bring them to relate more systematically to each other. So then this, of course, this also includes some space for that those ways of knowing also criticize each other. It's not just I listen to you and I don't understand anything, but I respect it. There's also a space for criticizing each other. But there's a kind of trick. It's a kind of balance. On the one hand, you have to have that mutual critique. On the other hand, you have that mutual active listening to a certain extent. So it involves, of course, that maybe you cannot fully understand the other approaches, at least from your way of knowing's perspective. So you do not denounce it. It's only an opinion what they have there because it doesn't fit with my logic. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't have critical exchange. Another aspect that is discussed by my colleague Uli Wilsmeyer, that she's advocating, is this idea of doing boundary work, meaning identifying and exploring existing boundaries which are the dynamic result of processes of identity, of distinction at the personal level, the phenomenological level, and the institutional level. It's about making those implicit boundaries explicit. And she thinks that this kind of work can disclose a transdisciplinary research space, or research spaces rather, because there's several of them. Another thing that's very important, and that relates back to Dee's lecture yesterday, is the need for more, or for the whole morning session yesterday actually, is the idea of the need for a more than rational knowing. So if you look at the ideas of, for example, on reflexivity, you have, I know, I have 5 minutes still. I will just eventually end, don't worry, even in the middle of it. Yeah, so you have Ulrich Beck and the idea of this kind of reflexive modernity, but it's still a very rational one. And then you have other people like Scott Lash who already start looking at reflexive modernity in a different way, including other forms of reflexivity. And then if you look at my dear friend Hans Dillemann, the guy who brought me into all of that, then he talks even in a quite interesting way about the multiple reflexivities of artists. It's in an article from 2008. So this calls forward a very serious engagement of all transdisciplinarity researchers with actually arts-based research or artistic research, and more generally with what Dillemann calls artful inquiry. So that means including the personal, including the inner drives, including the own interests, the interests of the individual person within the research process. This means exploring them, unearthing them when they are maybe hidden. So this goes against the traditional imperative in science to exclude the personal, to exclude the subjective, as I already said earlier. This also relates to approaches that exist for quite a while. For example, there's a phenomenology that's been there for quite a while. Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and co. I mean, it's quite, it comes back. I mean, it's very relevant there. However, one should keep in mind that this idea of artful inquiry is not just emotions. Artful inquiry means working on the self, of course at the emotional level, but not only. Also at the level of intuitions, actually. But also at the intellectual level. Artful inquiry is also intellectual. So it's a reflection of the self and a subjective process also intellectually. And it's also working on a corporeal level. The embodied subjectivity is very important. So artful inquiry includes both the more linear, logico-deductive rationality. It's part of a process, but it also includes other forms of thinking, more like associative thinking, or what some people call lateral thinking, thinking in metaphors, or when especially Bateson talks about abduction, the way Bateson talks about abduction by comparison to deduction and induction. Besides, I already mentioned iterative thinking earlier, or iterative processes of research. Well, artful inquiry is very much related to those iterative processes. And here I'm quoting Dillemann. Artful doing requires a model that respects the essence of reflection in action, where thinking and acting are intrinsically linked. And then a bit later in his text, Dillemann says, do not start with an abstract vision, but start at the other end, with the execution. Then I could have a whole discussion on what's the difference between artistic research and arts-based research. We won't have time for that, but it's also relevant. Yeah, I will still just finish this part on these ways to meet the challenges shortly. Still have a couple of minutes. There's also one colleague from Berlin, Andreas Weber, who is a biosemiotic, is both biologist and a philosopher, biosemiotics, who talks about advocating for a radical first-person view, which, and I will quote him there. Andreas Weber. So it's a view which largely abandons the supposedly objective description, and then he talks about them like dead matter. So it's about abandoning these descriptions of dead matter obeying external laws. And then, and I'm just reading him now, a first-person position, on the contrary, insists on the ontological reality of subjective experience. It sees in the unique living experience we are constantly making a central feature to describe reality. It means that we should comprehend the world as made up of relationships instead of just objects and individuals, to view it as a process of unfolding experience instead of physical evolution only, to acknowledge that every interaction is a perceptive process which irrevocably changes the perceiver and the perceived, to experience the world as expressive of its living potential. It does not mean to suspend the generalization of world descriptions. It only takes into account that those have to include subjective experience, relationality, and embodiment. End of quote. So that was Andreas Weber. So what Andreas Weber proposes is, and it will sound funny, I'm sure, to you as it does to me, but it's an interesting way of phrasing it. He proposes combining an empirical subjectivity with a poetic objectivity. And substituting, and then that's his big claim in a recent brochure, he published an essay just 1 year ago. He wants to replace sustainability with enlivenment. So, you know, we had enlightenment a while ago, which had big influence, and he's talking about now enlivenment, which of course makes many people crazy or angry, etc. It's an interesting, controversial notion. Then, of course, there's other possible areas of inspiration. For example, John van Breda in South Africa talks a lot about the Ubuntu philosophy. So Ubuntu is not just a Linux operating system, it's also a South African philosophy that has to do with a fundamentally relational worldview where humans and non-humans coexist with each other and exist through each other. So that's something that van Breda is using. And then another aspect is the importance of social creativity that several people, including myself, also Dieleman, are looking at. So not just individual creativity, especially in the arts, but also group creativity, in order to foster and inspire multiple innovations towards resilient communities. Actually, Dieleman there speaks about spaces of imagination and experimentation in cities that have to be fostered. And I'm personally looking at how these contribute to developing cities as Anthropocenes, but not Anthropocenes like the Anthropocene age, but Anthropocenes SCE, you know, like scenes. Yeah, there's some more problems with both approaches and misadventures. I could tell you some stories of misadventures of some transdisciplinary projects I've been in, but I won't have time for that. I also wanted to relate it to cultures of sustainability and to the Kulturwissenschaften in Germany and the turns, the cultural turn and all the other turns, but I won't have time for that. I wanted to talk, what else? Oh yeah, especially about my work, about aesthetics of sustainability, about aesthetics of complexity. I wanted to tell you a bit what Morin says, what is the complexity of Morin and La Méthode, and why the more, and the whole is more than the sum of its parts, but it's also less than the sum of its parts at the same time.
You perhaps answering the question.
Yeah, sure. But I just want to, exactly. Don't worry, I'm just 30 seconds over time now. And then I also wanted to talk about queering of knowings, but I think it has a lot to do with the idea of queer ecologies that colleagues in, like Sandilands, Catriona Sandilands in Canada are working on. Very interesting ideas in queer ecologies. But last thing I want to do is show you a little video, because everybody was showing videos. So I'm also going to show a video, thanks, with sound. And I will end that with a short statement just that follows from the video. Good, thanks a lot. And that's a video from Lars von Trier, so maybe some of you saw it, but so what? It's only 1 minute 32, so don't worry, there will be time for discussion. What is that?
is it said? Chaos?
So the fox, it's Antichrist from Lars von Trier, and the fox just said chaos reigns.
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 R-E-I-N-S.
R-E-I-G-N-S. Yeah.
Could be R-E-I-N-S.
Yeah. Yeah. So chaos reigns. So I just wanted to finish with this one sentence. So, or a couple of sentences which were just like, I mean, I'm not a performer like Dee, or actually my friend David Haley in Manchester, who always says in his performances or in his lectures at universities, we must learn not to be afraid of complexity. So, I just add to that another line, which is, we must learn not to be afraid, we must learn not to be afraid of chaos. Thank you.